Okay, guys, so welcome to our third electrolyte, which is an inorganic phosphate. So just like your calcium class, so most of your inorganic phosphate are part of your hydroxyapatite. So it's stored in your bones, 20% are in your soft tissues, and 1% are in our circulation. So class, it is inversely related to calcium. So class, every time calcium is reabsorbed into your tubules of the kidneys, class, your phosphate is thrown out of the urine, released in the urine. So every time calcium is reabsorbed, phosphate is thrown out in the urine. But class, though that happens, inorganic phosphate is still very important. Yan, its three forms are free phosphate. So so these are your active phosphate, the one that participates in our biological processes. Complex phosphate, that the one that are attached to your cations, and protein bound, which is attached usually to your albumin. So the uses of your inorganic phosphate, kaya napakahalaga niya. Yan, kasama siya sa phosphate backbone class ng DNA and RNA. Yan, we have phosphates are also your coenzymes. If we don't have phosphates class, we don't have sources of energy. Just like in your ATP, creatine, phosphate, phosphoenolpyruvate. And class, phosphate also participates in the delivery of oxygen to the tissues. When there is 2,3-DPG in the hemoglobin class, your oxygen is easily released in your tissues. Pero if there's no 2,3-DPG class, your hemoglobin just hold on to your oxygen. So 2,3-DPG, napakahalaga nan sa oxygen dissociation curve in your favorite subject, hematology. Yan. So class, what else? It's regulated by your hormones. Yan. So your hormones facilitates the reabsorption of phosphate in the intestine, whether it is released from cells, released from bones, or excreted in the urine or reabsorbed. Yan. So, andito na naman yung dalawa nating hormones, which is parathyroid hormones. So class, your parathyroid hormones facilitate actually the decrease of phosphate. Yan. So it excrete your phosphate in the urine. Yan. To facilitate the absorption of calcium. Vitamin D, however, increases phosphate by increasing the absorption of phosphate in your intestine and kidney, and class, your growth hormones, class. So it will decrease. So it will inhibit the excretion of phosphate in your urine. Yan. So yung PTH ang nagpapababa ng phosphate. And class, phosphate deficiency usually lead to ATP depletion because it's very important part of our energy currency in the body. Yeah. So, class, mababa lang ang value ng phosphate. So, about 2 to 4.5 milligrams per DL. Yan. So, for hyperphosphatemia, so usually class in hypoparathyroidism, in renal failure class, so wherein there is difficulty in excretion of your phosphate, class lymphoblastic leukemia. So class, our immature lymphocytes, so kasi nga lymphoblastic leukemia, so may cancer sa dugo wherein there is excess lymphoblast or immature lymphocytes. So usually, pag namamatay itong mga immature lymphocytes class, inside them are phosphates. So yun, they are released when there are excess lysis of this immature lymphoblasts. We have hypervitaminosis, yan. And in cases sa mga neonates, sila usually nagkakaroon ng hyperphosphatemia, hypophosphatemia, so avitaminosis D, so there is decreased vitamin D, myxedema, alcohol abuse, hyperparathyroidism, and so on. So class, same thing. So lithium heparin tayo sa container natin. No to hemolysis. Yan. We cannot also use oxalate, citrate, and EDTA. Class, ito yung naiiba sa phosphate. There is diurnal variation wherein phosphate levels changes. It happens so during the late morning. So late morning, it is highest level. No, late morning, afternoon ba to? Afternoon, and lowest in the evening. Okay. High carbohydrates level will decrease the levels of the analytes. Okay. Ang ingay ng aso ko recently. Okay. Fisk-Subaru method. So, it's the only test for our phosphate. So, the measurement of ammonium molybdate complex. So, we complex phosphate with aluminum molybdate. So, it is measured at 340 nanometers, or molybdenum blue, which is measured at 600 to 700 nanometers. So class, and next class, very short lang, we have another anion, we have bicarbonate. Yan. It is the second most abundant anion outside the cells. Yan. Second most abundant, ECF. So next, anion to the ECF. Okay. Accounts for 90% of total carbon dioxide at physiological pH. So class, your carbon dioxide attaches to your bicarbonate producing carbonic acid. Yan, napakahalaga nila sa acid-base balance. It is a major component in the buffering system, yan, in the maintenance between acid and base of our blood, and we have this term as chloride shift. Yan. So your bicarbonate and chloride exchanges, so that exchanges to maintain the neutral charge. Yan, chloride shift. So chloride shift happens with bicarbonate. So class, just like your calcium, it should be collected anaerobically. So we should not expose it to air so that it will not release any carbon dioxide. Class, we can use ISE and enzymatic method, and reference value is 21 to 28 milliequivalents per liter. So class, next, finally, yan, madali lang naman to class. We have an ion gap. So class, the rationale of this anion gap is all our anions, yan, must be equal to all cations. So the amount of anions, our negative charge particles, should be equal to the concentration of cations. Dapat equal sila ang mga positive charge at negative charge. Why? Para neutral ang katawan natin. Yan. We don't want our body to be very acidic when there is excess cations. We don't want our body to be very basic. Yan. Or there are excess anions. Yan. So class, tingnan natin tong diagram na to. So class, here are our cations. So sodium at saka yung potassium, these are the cations that we routinely measure. So the average normal value for our sodium is about, di ba, mga 130 to 150 to 120 to 130. Anyway, about 140 milliequivalents per liter. Tapos class, our potassium is 4 milliequivalent per liter. And ito nga yung mga routine na mini-measure natin. And we still have unmeasured cations, which are calcium, magnesium, and other proteins. So some proteins are positively charged. In class, here in this bar graph or diagram, so we have our anions or negatively charged. And so far, the one that we routinely measure are our chloride. Its average concentration is 104 milliequivalent per liter or milligrams per liter, or DL, I'm not sure. And bicarbonates, yan, milliequivalent per liter. And class, we still have unmeasured anions. Ayan. So class, notice nyo yung height nila. So class, your sodium, yan, your sodium, taas niya 140. Tapos yung bicarbonate natin and chloride, so medyo mababa. Yan, may space pa. So class, to get your anion gap, yan, the difference between your, yan, anion gap, The difference between unmeasured anion and unmeasured cation. I'll tell you what's the purpose of an ion gap later. But class, if you will measure itong matangkad na sodium minus class bicarbonate and chloride, we could get the anion gap. Yan, I'll tell you why do we have to get our anion gap. Plus, but notice class, ito yung formula na. So yung sodium, yung height ng sodium or yung concentration ng sodium, pag minus natin sa inad na sa total concentration ng chloride at saka bicarbonate, what we could get is an ion gap. Yan. So the difference between your unmeasured anion and cation. Yan. So sodium minus the concentration of chloride plus bicarbonate is your anion gap. So class, your anion gap is very important in differential diagnosis of acidosis. Yan. Yun, class. So your anion gap is very important in the differential diagnosis of metabolic acidosis. Class, some metabolic acidosis, notice, na hindi there's no increase in an ion gap, but there's such a thing as metabolic acidosis wherein there is increase of an ion gap. Yan. So it is for differential diagnosis of metabolic acidosis. Yan. Ma'am, so class notice, notice. So rumarami itong unmeasured anions. Yan, rumarami yung unmeasured anions. So, rumami siya. So, ma'am, ano ba yung cause kung bakit rumarami itong unmeasured anions or lumalaki yung anion gap? So, there could be pathologic acids. Yan. So, class, your pathologic acids are usually negative in charge. Yan, di ba? Hydrogen ion plus, kunyari, sulfuric acid, di ba? H plus sulfate, di ba? So usually, it actually more in the anion. Sa anion siya basta pag yung acids class, yung anion yung affected, kumbaga. So if there are sources of pathologic acids, example in alcohol poisoning class, there expect an increase in your anion gap. Yan. So what else? In ketoacidosis. Yan. In cases that there is starvation or unmanaged diabetes, yung hindi okay yung paggamit ng insulin or the person is not using insulin, ganyan. Or keto diet, no, hindi ko alam kung totoo yun. And class, yun nga, poisoning, methanol poisoning, ethanol, ethylene glycol poisoning, expect an increase of your anion gap. Lactic acidosis. At ma'am, kailan naman bumabang an ion gap? Yan. This is very rare. So in cases of hypoalbuminemia, yan, pakikolag yan, and hypercalcemia, yan. So decrease an ion gap. So class, that's all our discussion for the day. Thank you for listening and happy studying.